So, good evening, everyone, once again. My name is Arno Mieterdorfer. On behalf of the Austrian Cultural Forum Tel Aviv, it is my great pleasure to welcome you and to thank you for joining us tonight from near and far for this literary evening dedicated to Raphaela Edelbauer and her debut novel, The Fluid Land. This event has been organized in collaboration with our dear friends from Goethe-Institut Israel here in Israel and takes place in the framework of the European Book Club. The European Book Club is a joint initiative by a number of European national institutes for culture here in Israel and EU member states embassies. And the aim of the European Book Club is to facilitate the dialogue between modern and contemporary European literature and the interested public here in Israel. We're lucky to have Tel Aviv's public library, Bet Ariella, as our main partner in this endeavor. And obviously the main intention for our project is to host European writers here in Israel and to bring them together for personal literary encounters with the audience in Israel. The pandemic has naturally affected our plans, impeded our plans to a certain degree. However, the past months have also underscored quite clearly the importance of literature as a gateway to escape, as a mean to travel in spite of closed borders, as a possibility to encounter new characters and interesting personalities in spite of physical distancing, and simply to cherish diving into worlds created by words. Therefore, all the more we feel a strong degree of empowerment in our pursuit of connecting contemporary European literature with the interested public here in Israel. And therefore, I'm particularly pleased to welcome Raphaela Edelbauer tonight in our digital library here with you. Of course, we will give all of you the possibility to ask questions. You can use to this end the Q&A section in the menu below. And we will be happy to include your questions in our Q&A sessions with Raphaela Edelbauer in our conversation after the reading. And now it is my pleasure to hand over the floor to my dear colleague, Marietta Sander, Head of Library and Information at Goethe-Institut Israel. Thank you very much.
2 years ago, on the 28th November 2018, I attended a literature evening at the Club of the Austrians in Tel Aviv. I was relatively new in this country and I didn't know before that such a club even exists. That evening was the first time I met the young Austrian author Raphaela Edelbauer. She was introducing her anti-Heimat novel, The Fluid Land. I was really impressed by the way she was describing that mysterious underground grottos in a small town in Austria with a dark past in the Nazi era. I was shocked that such a terrible cave could exist. Later in the social mingling, I expressed my interest in planning a book launch with her. Finding the Austrian Cultural Forum as a partner, this idea came finally today to a realization. So I'm very happy this evening to be here with my colleague Arno Mieterdorfer, Attaché and Director of the Austrian Cultural Forum. Together we will introduce Raphaela and her novel to you, our dear audience. Later on, as he told already, there's a possibility for you to ask questions. Just find this on the bottom of the page. I will share with you a few facts about the author. Raphaela Edelbauer studied language art at the University of Applied Arts in Vienna with Robert Schindel. In 2012, she began studying philosophy at the University of Vienna. Edelbauer has been publishing in literature magazines and anthologies and is appearing at literature festivals since 2009. She wrote commissioned works for the city of Mödling and the Ministry of Women. For her prose debut Entdecker, a Poetics, published in February 2017, she was awarded the main prize of the Rauris Literature Prize in 2018. In 2017, she received a scholarship from the German Literature Fund for the manuscript of her novel The Liquid Land. In 2018, she read at the invitation of Klaus Kastberger as the only Austrian participant in the Ingeborg Bachmann competition, where she was awarded the Audience Prize and the City of Klagenfurt's scholarship. Edelbauer writes texts of contemporary composers. Among others, she worked with Stefan Aschberg and Robin Hay. Her novel The Liquid Land was shortlisted for the German Book Prize in August 2019 and in third place of the ORF Best List in October and November 2019. When I first read The Fluid Land, I felt a comforting shudder. Since the story brings a dark time in the last century to light, it leaves on a very pensive and worried feeling. But get an impression for yourself in the following video.
Hello, my name is Raphaela Edelbauer and I'm the author of the book The Liquid Land, which is going to appear next year in English and hopefully in Hebrew too in the future. I'm here in my parents' house in Hinterbrühl, close to Vienna, to show you some of the backgrounds, tell you a few stories about how this book came to be, and of course also to read something for you. We jump right into the life of my main protagonist, Ruth, a young physicist whose life is turned upside down when one morning she gets a call. In the small hours of September 21st, 2007, I spilled around 200 milliliters of coffee over my insistently ringing mobile phone, which had so abruptly prompted me to pick it up, disturbed as I was by the withheld number. I hadn't had time to put down my cup. Vexed by the disruption of my work, it took me a few seconds to comprehend who was speaking to me. A policeman was on the line, and without the verbiage of an elaborate greeting, he told me that my parents had lost their lives in a car accident that night. Their lives? I asked, even though I had immediately understood. While I continued to stare at my lecture on vector spaces and watched the intricate Scalar products dance before my eyes, the executive told me what had happened. The red Audi, the license plate of which having been used to identify my parents, must have come off the road last night and swerved down a scree like an avalanche in the vicinity of Suan Valley. The peculiar thing was, the officer explained to me, that neither of them presented any wounds or signs of compression. There was a dented section on their car resulting from the confrontation with the crash barrier, and yet there was much to suggest that this was not the cause of their deaths. The vehicle must have slid down the slope at a rate of infinitive slowness after the impact, turning sluggishly to its spine position like a dying insect before gently grinding over the ridge into the depth. The fall, which had been completely invisible to other drivers from the Semmering Expressway due to heavy fog, had come to its probably soundless conclusion in a common oak tree, according to the policeman. I was sitting in bed in pyjama bottoms and bra, the laptop with the open script of my inaugural lecture on my knees, finding myself at once in the middle of a painting with erroneous perspective. The corners of my apartment, the park outside my window, every chair, every shelf, began to creak into motion, jamming up against one another. The man on the telephone carried on undeterred, impatient to bring his ambassadorial task to a close. It is clear, therefore, that the impact did not lead to their deaths, nor had, and he stressed this, the layout of the road been responsible for this tragic accident. The pathologist's report would bring us final certainty about the cause of death in a few days, the man told me, and I could hear in his tone, which wavered between the tempo of a traffic officer and a detective, that he was also facing this situation for the first time. Both of us had already mechanically said goodbye and hung up by then. For an endless morning I lay silently in my sweepwear, alternating back and forth between lying on my side, my front and my back. From my bed, I watched the metronomic phases of the traffic lights outside my window until I had practically given up hope that a revolution would take place within me. Instead, I was overcome by a feeling from which a certainty gradually emerged. I had evidently long been part of a calculation, a ceremony put in place already prior to my birth that would now unfold. The cosmic organ had been cranked into motion. All the roles had been allocated, the cocks mashed together, all cylinders in the mechanics had been waiting to be called for their morning duty. I would of course organize a funeral. So as we heard, Ruth has to go into her parents' hometown, a town that is quite mysterious from the beginning, and when she finds that town, she very soon realizes that there's something wrong with that, because there's a gigantic hole lurking under the entirety of that town structure and is almost swallowing the houses. And she soon finds out through her own research that during World War II and during the ending days of National Socialism, something happened in that town. And my main inspiration for that was my own hometown, Hinterbrühl, so I will now take you on a walk and show you the main sites that the real history has taken place at. So in my book, there's a mysterious countess that has some kind of strange control over everything happening within that town. And my idol for that was the dukes and duchesses of Liechtenstein, who played a major role here in the area and did some really strange things, like for example putting fake architectural buildings like Roman ruins that were fake from the beginning into the landscape, and I found that a very fascinating thing. So you see, this is the See Grotto, which translates to underground lake grotto or something like that, and it's a tourist attraction that pulls thousands and thousands of Japanese and American people to Hinterbrühl every year. But only when I was 18 or something did I find out that this was actually an underground concentration camp in which at peak times 2,000 concentration camp inmates were forced laborers to screw together plain parts under horrible conditions. And this is something that people would never admit. When I was here with a journalist from Haaretz and we asked the guy who led us around the grotto what happened to those people that worked there, he said that they just returned home. And so she asked, so they survived? And he said, yes, they survived. So people here have a very problematic relation to the past. So the official version was that this grotto was overtaken by the Wehrmacht, but I think the story is a bit more complicated. On Easter Monday, the 2nd of April 1945, the 2,000 inmates of Satellite Camp 3, Mauthausen, Gau-Groß-Vienna, were summoned from the shallow mine where they had been screwing aircraft parts together for 13 months. Once they had been assembled into orderly squads on the meadow before the barracks by the main descent, it was decided that, due to their sheer unmanageable volume, 1,200 of them were to be sent on a death march to Burgenland. While the church bells rang for the second time and the children squealed with pleasure, As they hunted colorful Easter eggs in the gardens nearby, the formation slipped away as quietly, as wordlessly as it had arrived. Those who had been on their way to church would later report their own accounts of having seen this exodus, but most of them claimed to have slept in that day. It was an ice-cold morning with temperatures barely above freezing. The remaining 800 men stood barefoot in the snow. The young guards who had been left in charge, 10 men, 6 of whom were barely of legal age, trembled nervously, burdened with the immense task at hand, shuddering at the thought of his execution, the sheer numbers and, not least, the biting cold. The order had been given. At around 8 o'clock, the fatigued and emaciated men were penned into the barracks again so they could be dealt with in small groups of 40. They were ordered to lie on their backs in the hoarfrost, arms outstretched to the side. Then their dirty striped uniforms were unbuttoned in order for gasoline injections to be administered just below the breastbone. The novice guards had been ordered to save ammunition in anticipation of the inevitable and fast approaching defense of Vienna. The small unit consisted, it was said, of nothing more than a bunch of panicky village boys flailing under the enormity of the task, so that a third of the injections missed the mark. Death occurs in a matter of minutes if the gasoline is injected directly into the heart. But if the lungs are punctured, the seizure, paralysis, and eventual suffocation that follows lasts for hours. 40 plus 40 is 80, plus 40 is 120, plus 40 makes 160, and so on. In other words, by midday, the 10 guards, alternating each time, 5 digging pits, 5 administering gasoline, had killed 200 people, at least 70 of whom were still in the process of dying. Confronted with the immense strain of producing a mass grave, the men started to get nervous. 240 plus 40 only makes 280, so they unanimously agreed to bury alive those prisoners who were still dying. Each one rolled their share of 50 bodies into the pits and scattered loose soil on top, while the next 40, and thus 320, 360, and then 400, were brought out from the barracks. You would have required more men from the village to keep digging, and you would have picked the next 40 to prepare the soil for the subsequent 40, and thus 440 and 480, then 520. You couldn't tell if the earth was going to provide enough room under the tight claustrophobic crust. When there was no longer enough space, the remaining men were brought into the hole, the deepest tunnel, in one of its furthest branches, where the aircraft parts were still lying on the ground, and locked behind the heaviest fire door. The guards were frozen to the bone and bleary-eyed, as they became aware of strange noises coming from the hole, and they found that the stones had been rolled away. In the growing blackness it was barely discernible at first, when suddenly from below, from the pit, filled with the soil that had been excavated 12 hours earlier, bodies began writhing. The last breathing remnants, who had worked their way out of the graves, grappled for air. They shuddered at the horror that had arrived. Then finally, shots. So this is the former site of the old concentration camp. It was a side camp of the very well-known concentration camp Mauthausen, and we had hundreds of people here crammed together on this small site. So at first there was a lot of resistance from the townspeople to even do this memorial site that you can see here today, and a couple of times it also was destroyed by unknown perpetrators. So here an unknown number of bodies is buried. We know 34 names, which you can read on that black part, on that black stone. So the horrifying story goes like this. On the evening of Easter Monday 1945, when the Russians and the Allies stood in front of Vienna, the people that led this camp were forced to cleanse it out, as they said in German. And the people who were unable to move, they were killed with gasoline injections into their heart and just thrown into a mass grave and then collectively forgotten. All the other people who could march are still dead. They were sent on a death march to Mauthausen. The ones who survived were put to death there in gas chambers. And just a couple of weeks ago, a man of one of the handful of survivors, just a few people could flee, who was called Marcello Martini, was buried here. A part of his ashes, he was one of the inmates of these concentration camps as a 14-year-old just, and as a gesture of forgiving, he wanted that a part of him be buried here on this site. If you enjoyed my reading, I would love if you follow me on social media. You will be updated on all the translations that are available. You can either visit raphaelaedelbauer.com, where you find all my social media profiles, or just visit, on all the main platforms, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, to keep updated. So greetings to Tel Aviv. I hope you have a warmer weather than we do here, and see you soon.
Thank you very much, Raphaela. Nice greetings back from Tel Aviv to Austria. Indeed, the weather is a bit warmer here, but of course for us, winter is winter nonetheless. Thank you so much for this very personal video, for a very interesting video, of course, at times seemingly unsettling, discomforting, sobering, but certainly, as from my point of view, very enriching. And I feel the video, the way it was made, gives a very, very good glimpse and introduction to the world that you open and that you invite people to enter in the fluid land. The various locations that you lead us to, they're all rather close to home, in your case quite literally, coming from your hometown and the vicinity and the area around it. It's all woven into the fabric also that the main location of the novel is made of, the town of Groß-Einland, Greater Einland as it is called. And this town seems to me as a place very rich in metaphor, as a place devastated in war, buried, reconstructed, seemingly immaculately reconstructed, only then over time to show scars and ruptures, to simply show also that the foundations and to so much beauty quite often are rather dark. Now, what I would be interested in is Groß-Einland, the main location, seems to be a mirror, right? A mirror to of the place that you grew up in. Would you also say that it's a mirror of your home country as a whole? And how would you say, do you perceive the assessment of history? How would you say that the people you live with, the Austrians nowadays, live with history? So it'd be quite interesting to hear your assessment on that, particularly also in light of the comprehensive efforts undertaken by Austria in recent years, acknowledging its shared responsibility also, particularly for the Shoah. So I'd be quite interested to hear your take on that. Thank you.
Can the audience hear me? I mean, okay, they cannot answer, so I guess they do. So I want to excuse myself in advance if anybody has heard that before, because I've read like maybe 1.5 years ago, I think, at the Austrian Cultural Forum already, and apparently the book hasn't changed much since, but the reception has. So due to my nomination for the German Book Prize, I have had a big reading tour. So I've maybe had 40 readings or something, and the reactions were plenty. So to answer that maybe with like not even an anecdote, it's quite sad actually. So whenever I have a reading, people come to me afterwards and they tell me, they love to tell me their own family history. And all the people tell me, oh, I know what you're talking about. It's just like that in my hometown. So it seems to be quite exemplary. But then they always tell me, and it's horrible that we're in this state now and that's, you know, populism and blah, blah, blah. But my family, did you know that they were in resistance? So everybody, every single person tells me that their parents were in the resistance. And I find that so utterly fascinating, because even though we are admitting that things on a wider scale are going wrong, I think nobody can admit it for their own families. That's something very hard, to look into your own family history and like admit to yourself that maybe your wonderful grandparents that were so loving and caring were not on a political level. So yeah, I think that's where the younger generation is at. And of course, I'm also in a bubble, you know, I'm talking so much to other artists, to other people who studied at the universities and so on and so on. And of course, they're not representative, I think. But especially in Carinthia, I must admit, I have been arguing a lot with people after events. So it really depends. It really depends. I'm very happy that now during the last elections, the direction was changed a bit, at least.
Raphaela, I would like to ask you a more technical question. The novel's special character has very different stylistic ascriptions. How would you classify the novel and its style itself?
I would classify it myself. I'm just thinking about a good kind of reference point in English, because that's, of course, even in German, it would be a very hard question to answer if you know all the references I'm making. So how would I classify? It's certainly funny. That's something that wasn't conveyed in the parts that I was reading now. So it's certainly something very. It's like a parody, but you know, not one where somebody's slipping on a banana, but rather one that is kind of exaggerating some stylistic characteristics, especially about the Austrian way of talking, of living, of small town societies and stuff like that. So I think it's quite an entertaining read, I was told. But on the other hand, it certainly deals with topics that maybe some people know from people like Thomas Bernhard. I really don't know who's famous in Israel or who's known of the Austrian writers. Like maybe Elfriede Jelinek or Hans Lebert. I'm quite sure he hasn't been translated into English even, maybe. But he wrote a famous work called Die Wolfshaut, the wolfskin. And it's like this motion of the earth, of the landscape, having swallowed some things and then kind of freeing it from the soil. And that is also a creepy element. So I really love dark romanticism, like especially the German tradition of, like, for example, E.T.A. Hoffmann, and this kind of creepiness partnered with humor.
Thank you.
Okay.
We have a question from, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, yeah.
We have one question from Tammy here in the Q&A section. I'm going to read this. Are people angry at you for bringing out such a difficult issue? Is there a difference among groups, age groups, Jews versus Christians, etc.?
That's a good question. So the problem is that most of the newspapers, as well as most people who go to readings and such things, they will be leftists, which means in an Austrian context that they will be very welcoming of those topics. On the other hand, I had most of the time I get anonymous letters or some like creepy emails where people tell me, especially most of the time the argumentation goes like, you're a young woman, like what do you know about the frights of war? how could you know? You cannot judge. And once I remember that I was at a reading in Alte Schmiede in Vienna, and there was like this old man who was, I don't know, like I was seeing him go around the corners and stuff and always looking at me, and he wanted to talk to me. And then I went up to him and I said, how did you like the reading? And he said, you didn't know what it was like to live under Hitler. And he, like, his intention was he wanted to get, how do you call that in English? He wanted to be spoken free or something. Like, no, that's not. Do you know the word? Arno certainly knows the word.
Liberate?
Yeah, liberated, something like that from his guilt. Mm-hmm. So I had these reactions as well. They're quite strange, and then most of the times I start to argue with those people because, I mean, I think it's a necessary thing, and I think like this kind of view through the eyes of our generation, it's very important because the last real testimonies of that time, they're dying now, or they're dead already. Like when I was writing, I could barely find anyone who had witnessed it anymore with their own eyes. And I think to create this kind of consistency, temporal consistency in talking about these topics, it's more important than ever. But yeah, of course, you were right when you were suggesting that there's a great divide between the generations.
I would like to read the comment of a member of our audience. He's writing, "Dear Raphaela, thanks for the soul-shattering story. I was in the See Grotto, heard the story, but not so plastically. I learned to know some people in Hinterbrühl and visited the memorized site. As a son of a Jew who was on the death march to Mauthausen, I was, and I'm still shocked." So now we have really a time witness here, our audience.
Yeah, and amazing that you went to Hinterbrühl as well. That's quite rare, I think.
Also referring to maybe or adding on to the comment by Mr. Klein, one of the main locations also in the novel seems to be the archive that the main character goes to dive into the history also of the town and to conduct research, and it seems as though it was a place where reality and fiction kind of mingle. And yeah. I wanted to see or ask for you, because you, of course, conducted a lot of research prior to writing this novel. Is this, in a way, symbolic of the research you've done? And could you elaborate a bit on the research that you've conducted prior to this work? Because it seems rather groundbreaking for you as well to have conducted the research prior to putting it into the novel.
Yes, of course. So the sad part is that there's no such thing as a town archive. There was no such thing. These archives, they burned down a couple of months after the war ended, mysteriously, always. So there's no such thing. The research that I conducted was in the Ministry of Interior. There's something called Mauthausen Archive. But the problem is that they have it in boxes. Like they have just boxes and boxes with paperwork, basically, that has no, do you say hashtags? No, probably not. Like Schlagwort, they don't have words that you could search it by, basically. And that was really problematic because it took a long time to get a hold of that. And then there's this story that I like to tell. So maybe I've told it already, so please don't be mad if you already heard it. But there was this man from Hinterbrühl who is the town's historian or something. Like every small town in Austria has a town's historian that sits in his cellar and has I don't know what. And he wrote a letter to the mayor saying that he knows details about what happened that night that the public doesn't know, but they're related to some people who still are alive, and so he does not want that to come out while he's still alive. So now we can only open this letter when he's dead. And that's quite, so he ensured that by legal measurements, and that's quite sad, I think, that there's still some interest to not bring out the details of that. And there has been actually a book coming out, I think maybe 2 months ago or something, by another historian who collected data to the sea Grotto. And yeah, I haven't read it so far because my new book is coming out soon, but I will certainly. So this is not a closed case in any way.
Actually, I would like to ask you, what does the chapter of Paragahannas mean in this context? Because it's a big chapter, and for me it was very interesting, but also a little bit astonishing that there was this interruption in the story.
Yeah, that's right. So maybe for people who have not read the book, so maybe all of them, because the first translation in English is, by the way, I was asked this in private chat, so maybe I answer it right now. It will come out in 2021, certainly. So it was supposed to come out in spring already. Now we're a bit delayed. So maybe late summer or during summer, the English translation will be available. And it's really important to note that it's called The Liquid Land now. So The Fluid Land, it was the working title, but we agreed on The Liquid Land. So in case you will search it later. Okay, so to answer your question, in the middle of the book, there's this kind of folkloristic, mythical narration about like the patron or something of that town called Paragahannas. And Paragahannas, he was oh my God, I should have specifically prepared for those questions because I don't know what Gerbermeister means. So it's somebody who makes leather artifacts, so like boots and gloves and yeah, leatherware. And he supposedly lived maybe 500 years ago or something, so medieval. And he went down into the hole and he made a pact with the devil. And later on, the entire town collapsed. So it's like this, it's like a marriage between very fantastical elements and historical things that, so what I wanted to do with that is, firstly, the book in general is a mixture between this kind of mythology that I think makes up the identity of people. So I think this is a very important psychological factor, to say things you cannot say, by kind of clothing it into a costume of a different time. You know what I mean? Like it's a narration about basically what happened during National Socialism, I think, for me, but encoded in this language of something that has never happened, that is a bit fantastical, that is maybe like a fairy tale or something, but is highly important for the identity of the townspeople. So you will notice in this narration that only Roma and Sinti children, they disappeared during that. So I consciously took Roma and Sinti names to represent the people who disappeared in this fairy tale. So it tells something about the history of the town and the crimes that happened there, but in a way that people can talk about it. And I think that's something that happens in real life as well.
Thank you. We have one more question, one very interesting question, in fact, as well as all of your questions are from the audience. Thank you so much. And everyone who has questions, please provide us with them. Ilana wants to know, how did your family respond to your research and your novel? I think this is very interesting because, of course, your family still lives there, and they are in this cosmos of Hinterbrühl, your hometown, which is reflected in the novel. So yeah, very interesting.
I think my family responded, of course, they respond very well, because they support everything I do and they're with that cause. But I think it is made easy by the fact that my grandparents aren't with us anymore. So I think it would have been much harder because, you know, as hard as it is to admit, of course, they were in some way, like as most people that survived, they must have been collaborators of the regime. So I think it would have been much more difficult if they were still alive. But the thing that was a bit unpleasant was that once when I was, so I always like to, I love to make videos. I often produce YouTube videos, and I did one which was a parody of identitarian movement. Like I explained that back then, but they're like a right-wing group in Austria and Germany and other European nations as well, I think, like France, for example, that are in my age group and like reproduce basically, I think, Nazi stereotypes. And I did, I made a video about a group of people that meets and they do rune gymnastics. So they do like old Celtic letters and stuff like that. And it's you know who I'm talking about within this movement if you see it and if you know them. And so there was once an occasion when they posted on Twitter the private address of my parents' house, and they said you can thank her by going there personally. And that was very uncomfortable. And I think that's where maybe my parents weren't that happy anymore, but luckily it has ended, and that was just an episode. But basically they're very supportive, yeah.
There's another question of our audience by Tami. Why did you change the name in the translation? What is the original name and its meaning in German?
Yes, so the original name is Das Flüssige Land, which can either be translated into the liquid land or the fluid land. I chose the liquid land, or I spoke to the translator, of course, and asked for her agreement, because my protagonist, she's a physicist. And I wanted to have this connotation of aggregate states. And the aggregate states of liquidity is called liquid. And thus we changed it. And I think it sounds nicer. I hope you agree and don't type now into the chat, no, that's worse. But I thought it was more appropriate for my work.
Actually, I found that also the time is very liquid in this book.
Yeah.
And the protagonist, Ruth, she seems to lose the track of time. How did you come up with this idea? And you were adding some paragraphs about the theory of time, which I found very interesting.
Yeah, so it's something stable in my work that I always deal with the language of science, because that's something that I think makes up the way in which we perceive the world, and it seems to be solid. So that's the funny thing. And you know, if you go deeper into the history of science, you see that all those paradigms shift all the time. So I think it's highly fascinating to take that and show how there's also some kind of fiction behind the stability of the universe in scientific fact. And I think it adds a layer that is very unused in a way. So, you know, you have these metaphors that you reproduce over and over again and you read in books all the time. And I think that's a pond that hasn't been stepped into too often. So that's why I always do it. And in this book, of course, it went together with the plot of memory failing, of the past not being that solid, of, you know, the liquid land. It also means that the ground on which you're walking and the ground that is, you know, the baseline for everything else that you're doing, itself, it's not solid. And thus you can never say what really happened, because the narrations and the identity that you got from your parents, they're highly influenced by their biographies. And thus you always have an angle of looking at the world. And that's what I try to do to make clear with these intersections.
Thank you for this. One thing about the liquid land is, of course, it really leads you through a story. It leads to many interesting places. That starts with the way that the main protagonist comes to Großeinland, you know, and then finding this seemingly surreal yet kind of real environment, and all of a sudden you really make a lot of images pop up. So I wonder, are there any thoughts, or would you be keen on having the novel adapted to movie? Is there anything already in the process? Because it really seems as though this could come on the silver screen, on the big screen as well. So I'd be interested in hearing about that.
Yeah, there's actually a director that has bought the license already. So it's very likely that it will be made into a movie. It's a German director, so it will feature a more artsy style, not like, I mean, I wouldn't say no if Hollywood knocked on my door, but I think it's very fitting. So I saw a series of his, I cannot say his name because it's not made legal yet, but I think it will be a very interesting movie. We have to change some minor things. Because, you know, what you said now, like to open these underground spaces, it can demystify something about that if you show it really in picture. So it has to be translated into the language of film accordingly. But I think I'm really looking forward to it. Yeah.
Yeah, I would also like to ask in which languages the book is already translated, as the Goethe-Institut is also promoting some translations. And how did you get to this translator, Marshall Yarbrough? And you already told us it's going to be on the market already in next year.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So it is translated into French, Italian, English, and Dutch. So those are the ones. We're still trying our best for Spanish because it's a major language, but haven't been lucky so far. And I would love for a Hebrew translation actually to appear. Yeah, but I know that it's a very rare thing. That's, you know, debut novels are translated into Hebrew. I've learned that it's not so easy. But if any of the audience want to translate, so I'm really open to everything.
It is indeed challenging, but that is also one of the goals of the European Book Club, to kind of not only increase awareness of the audience, but also increase, well, the awareness and appreciation of the local market also, quite bluntly speaking, to have more translation going on. So we will carry the book around, you know, very visibly all over the country, and spark interest among everyone, and hope that yeah, a translation will be in the making soon. Let's knock on wood. One question, I see the time is already rather advanced, and of course we know that you're a very studious and efficient worker. So I don't want to consume too much of your time. I wanted to ask, because you said that you work, I think, 9 or 10 hours a day, and that the follow-up to The Liquid Land is about to being wrapped up, or has already been wrapped up, set to be released rather soon. Could you give us any indication timeline-wise, and a little amuse-gueule also of what is awaiting your readers?
So I'm now working on the 3rd novel already, so my 4th book. But the one that is set to appear on the 23rd of January, also with Claire Grotto, of course, is about artificial intelligence. Something that I think will be a major topic of the upcoming years. And yeah, it's about what it means to be human, basically. It's again something very, I mean, I wouldn't say complicated. I don't find my books so complicated, but it's rather, you know, how would I say, like this, you know, the Penrose steps that always go up. you know, like something like an illusion or something. So I've been working on that book for 10 years. So I really hope it better be good. I've written it 3 times all the way through. So I started to write it the first time when I was 20, I think, and then figured out that it wasn't good enough for that plot. Wrote it the second time when I was 25, figured out that I still wasn't good enough. Wrote it a third time now when I was 29, which was last year, and this time it worked. So it was really harsh piece of work.
Third time's a charm, they say, right? So absolutely. Yeah, I think this was a highly insightful and interesting evening. Absolutely. Mariette, would you like to comment? Is there anything else that you would like to ask Raphaela?
I'm just looking forward to her next novel. And certainly we will provide it in our library and in our online, so our readers and listeners will be still attached to us.
And just say a thank you, because I see that almost all of the people who attended this online reading are still present. So that's the first time. I've done a couple of online readings since Corona started, but you've been really brave. Like, listen to me all the time. Thank you very much.
And we hope that they will soon be rewarded by being able to read The Liquid Land in English, and hopefully at some not too distant date in the future also in Hebrew, because it's even more intriguing as the cover already promises. So it's a masterpiece inside out. And yeah, so once again, thank you very much, Raphaela, for joining us tonight. And yeah, thank you for all the personal insight you've given us to the structure, to the building of the story, to the main, to the protagonist, to the main locations. It's been a very interesting journey now this past hour. Thank you to everybody who has been in attendance today. Thank you also to Mariette and everyone at Goethe-Institut for providing all the technical facilities in making the handling so smooth today. I'm very happy for all your efforts, and yeah, looking forward to hopefully welcoming you soon in Israel again, and to take you and the novel on a tour through the country. Amazing. And if there's anything else from Mariette or Raphaela, I will say thank you very much, and wish everybody a wonderful evening and great week, and hope to see you all very soon again.